You know, sometimes children notice things we adults think are invisible. Their innocence gives them eyes that see the truth we try so hard to ignore. My little son, with his tiny voice and wide, honest eyes, gave me a warning about his dad, a warning I almost laughed off because who could imagine the darkness behind someone you love and trust? But that warning was only the beginning. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw next. And today I want to share that story with you, not just to shock you, but to show how courage, awareness, and instinct can guide a mother when danger lurks closer than you ever expected. It started so innocently that I almost dismissed it entirely as the kind of remark a child might make when their imagination is busy at work, and yet when he said it my heart skipped a beat because there was something in his voice, something I could not ignore, something that tugged at the part of me that has always been attuned to the subtle whispers of a child's truth. My little boy had been playing with his small colorful blocks on the living room carpet, and I was tidying up around him, trying to finish some chores while keeping one eye on him because I have always believed in the power of observation and paying attention to even the smallest gestures, when suddenly he looked up at me with those wide innocent eyes that somehow convey the weight of a truth too heavy for a child to carry alone, and he said, "Mommy, I don't like it when Daddy gets mad at night." And I froze for a moment because the words sounded so simple, so ordinary, that at first I thought I had misunderstood, yet the way he hesitated before speaking, the careful pause between each word, told me that he was speaking with intention. He was choosing his words carefully, as if he knew I needed to hear them exactly the way he said them, and I remember kneeling down to his level and smiling at him gently, trying to reassure him that everything was okay, trying to dismiss the thought that something could be wrong, because who wants to believe that someone they love could be hiding darkness behind the facade of normalcy? Yet even as I smiled and held him close, I felt a shiver run down my spine, a subtle prickling of instinct that warned me that this was not imagination, this was a warning, this was a tiny voice trying to pierce the protective bubble that adults often create around themselves. And I whispered back softly, assuring him that everything was fine, that his feelings mattered, that he could always tell me what he was thinking. And watching the way he clutched his favorite toy bear close to his chest and nodded slowly, I felt the first seed of unease take root in my heart, a seed that would grow into something larger in the days to come, something I could not ignore. After that evening I found myself thinking about his words, constantly replaying them in my mind, analyzing every syllable, trying to decipher if I had missed some context, some hint that would explain why a small child would make such a strange and specific observation about someone he should feel safe with, his father. And as the week passed, I began noticing other subtle behaviors that matched what he had said, subtle signs that at the time seemed insignificant but in hindsight were pieces of a puzzle that was slowly revealing itself to me. I noticed the way my son flinched when his father raised his voice even slightly, how he would glance toward the door as if expecting someone to appear. I noticed how he would sometimes stop talking mid-sentence and look at me with an expression that was more like a plea than curiosity or confusion, as if he was silently asking me to protect him from something I could not yet see clearly. And I felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on me like never before, because a mother knows instinctively when a child is afraid, and even if you do not know the cause, you feel compelled to investigate, to observe, to pay attention to every tiny cue that could hold the key to understanding and protecting the one you love more than anything in the world. And I remember sitting by his bed that night after tucking him in, reading his favorite bedtime story in a voice that I hoped conveyed calm and safety, and noticing the way his small hand reached out to grip mine and how he squeezed it gently as if to reinforce a silent bond of trust and protection. And I whispered again, reassuring him that I was there and always would be, and I noticed how his breathing relaxed slightly, but the lingering tension in his shoulders told me that his fear had not fully dissipated. And I realized that this was bigger than a fleeting worry, bigger than a dream or misperception. This was a subtle cry for attention, a gentle signal that something in his world was not right, and only a mother who truly listens would catch it. Over the next few days I began to monitor every interaction carefully, noticing the patterns that emerged like pieces of a hidden script playing out in the corners of our home. I watched the small ways my son responded to his father's tone, the hesitation in his speech, the careful measurement of his movements, and the fleeting moments of hesitation that only a mother's eyes could see. I started documenting these small behaviors mentally, noting the times of day they occurred, the triggers that seemed to prompt them, the tiny gestures that communicated fear or discomfort without words, and each observation reinforced the initial warning he had given me, and yet I found myself caught in a strange tension between disbelief and certainty, because it is difficult to accept that someone you love and have shared your life with might have a side that is harmful, especially when it is hidden behind the ordinary routines of family life. And I questioned myself constantly. Did I misinterpret his words? Was I being paranoid? Was my instinct overreacting? And then I would look at my son's face with those honest eyes and realize that he was not imagining it. He was sensing something real, something that adults often overlook. And in that moment I understood that children perceive the world in ways we cannot always understand because they are not yet clouded by social expectations or rationalizations. They see truth in a raw form, and sometimes their intuition is far sharper than our reason. I also began to notice how he would sometimes speak in subtle codes when he thought his father was not listening. He would mention small things in passing, like "I do not like it when he yells at me," or "I wish he would not come in here when I am playing." And though these remarks could be brushed off by an adult as childish exaggeration, I felt the urgency behind them. I felt the quiet insistence that I pay attention and connect the dots, and the more I observed, the more I realized that ignoring a child's warning could have consequences far greater than I had ever imagined, because a mother's job is to see the unseen and hear the unheard and act on it before it is too late. And I found myself in a state of heightened awareness, constantly checking for patterns, noting behaviors, and listening for the smallest cues in tone or expression. And I became more protective and more vigilant without being overt about it, because I understood that if I revealed my concern prematurely, it could alert the source of danger and compromise the safety of the one I loved most. Every night I replayed the first words he had said to me in my mind over and over, trying to parse their meaning like a puzzle. I would run through the day analyzing moments I had dismissed before, noting how his hands trembled slightly when certain topics came up, noting how his body language shifted almost imperceptibly when his father approached. And I realized that my son's warning was a lifeline, a tiny beacon of truth that I could no longer ignore. I felt a deep maternal responsibility that went beyond fear and even beyond love. It was a raw instinct that demanded vigilance, observation, and action, and I understood for the first time the incredible power and insight that a child's perception can hold, even when the world around them seems ordinary or safe, because sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest warnings, and the smallest expressions carry the heaviest truths. And as I held him in my arms that night, I promised myself that I would protect him no matter the cost, that I would not dismiss his warning, that I would watch and listen and wait for the moment when I could act. And that promise filled me with a strange combination of fear, anticipation, and determination unlike anything I had ever experienced before, because it was the first step in a journey I could not yet fully see but knew I had to follow with unwavering attention and resolve. And that is how the warning began, a small whisper from the mouth of my little son that shook the foundation of my complacency and awakened in me a sense of vigilance and awareness that would change everything in the days and nights to come. After the warning my son gave me, I began noticing subtle signs that I had previously dismissed or overlooked, small details that suddenly took on new meaning and filled me with a growing unease. A mother's intuition is a strange thing. It starts as a whisper and then grows into an undeniable force that makes you see patterns that others cannot see. I watched my son closely and observed how his body would stiffen when his father entered the room, or how he would pause mid-step as if anticipating a reaction I could not yet understand. These were not accidents or ordinary childhood behaviors. They were tiny signals that something was brewing beneath the surface, something that had been quietly influencing him and shaping his experiences in ways I could not yet name. And the more I watched, the more I realized that these small signs were confirming the warning he had given me earlier, and the realization settled in my chest like a heavy stone, because children do not lie about their fears, they express them even if the world around them does not listen. I began documenting every small incident, mentally cataloging behaviors that seemed unusual, noting the times of day when my son appeared nervous or hesitant, the tone in his voice, the way his eyes darted toward the door, or the way he would clutch his favorite toy for comfort. I became hyper-aware of interactions that once seemed ordinary, like the way his father would raise his eyebrows or sigh impatiently or glance at him sharply during seemingly innocent conversations. I started connecting dots that previously seemed isolated incidents. Now they formed a pattern, a subtle but persistent undercurrent of tension and unease, and I could feel the knot in my stomach tighten each time I saw the small flickers of fear in my son's expression. At first I questioned myself constantly. Was I imagining things? Was I reading too much into innocent gestures? Was I creating a narrative where none existed? But each time I asked myself these questions, I returned to my son's eyes, his tone, his quiet insistence that something was not right, and I realized that I could not ignore the evidence of his experience. No matter how much I wanted to rationalize it away, I could not silence the small voice inside me that recognized the truth in his observations, because a mother senses what children cannot always articulate fully, yet they know instinctively, and his subtle signs were communicating something urgent and real, and it was my responsibility to pay attention to them fully. I began observing more than ever. I started noting the small inconsistencies in behavior that had previously seemed unimportant. The sudden change in my son's laughter when his father was present, the way he would sometimes freeze mid-action as if expecting something negative to happen, the way he would sometimes look at me with wide eyes silently pleading for reassurance and protection. All these small observations became a map of hidden tension, and I realized that these subtle signs were not isolated. They were connected threads weaving a story that my son could not yet articulate in words, and my role as a mother was to interpret the story carefully without letting fear cloud my judgment or alert the source of the danger too early. As the days passed, I noticed how my son's behavior shifted depending on the environment, how he responded differently when in rooms with his father versus when he was alone with me, how he sometimes spoke softly in half-formed sentences as if trying to test my understanding without revealing the full scope of his concern. I realized that children have an intuitive sense of danger that surpasses their verbal abilities, and that my son was using every tool he had to communicate his unease, and it was up to me to see it, to interpret it, and to act upon it before it became something irreversible. And in that awareness I felt the first true weight of responsibility, not just as a mother but as a guardian of his emotional and physical safety. I also noticed how his sleep patterns shifted in subtle ways, how he would wake at odd hours restless and tense, and how he sometimes resisted going to certain rooms or avoiding moments of interaction that were previously ordinary. I began keeping mental notes, not just of what he said but of what he did not say, the small pauses in conversation, the hesitation before responding, the fleeting glances and micro-expressions that communicated far more than words could convey, and each of these subtle signs strengthened the thread that connected back to his warning and confirmed that something beneath the surface was affecting him deeply, and that his father's behavior was more concerning than I had dared to imagine. Sometimes I would watch them together from across the room, noting the body language, the tiny cues that revealed tension or intimidation or unspoken discomfort, the way my son's shoulders would tense, the way his hands would fidget, or the way he would avoid eye contact for just a moment too long. Each small sign was a piece of evidence, a breadcrumb leading me toward the truth that I had been too afraid to confront fully. And as I observed, I realized that these were not just minor signs of ordinary parenting stress. They were indicators of something deeper, something more urgent, that required my full attention and strategic observation in order to ensure that I could protect him from potential harm and act decisively when necessary. I began speaking gently to my son in moments when he seemed most at ease, asking him about his feelings in ways that encouraged him to express what he could without fear of retribution or dismissal. His answers were sometimes fragmented, incomplete, or hesitant, but each answer was like a small window into his reality, a reality that I had to take seriously and that I had to interpret correctly, because children communicate truth through gestures, pauses, and tone as much as through words, and I understood that his subtle signs and my careful observation were slowly converging to give me a clearer understanding of what I was up against, and that this understanding was critical for the safety and well-being of both of us. The more I paid attention, the more I realized that his small warning had been the first alert in a series of signals that I had to follow carefully and systematically. I became more vigilant, more attuned, more sensitive to changes in his demeanor and in the way his father interacted with him. Every small interaction became a clue, a hint, a piece of the puzzle that I needed to decipher, and each time I noticed a subtle change in my son's mood or posture, I cataloged it mentally and prepared myself to respond appropriately, because I understood that these signs were not random. They were deliberate communications from a child trying to survive a situation that even he could not fully name, and that as his mother it was my responsibility to translate these signs into protection, guidance, and ultimately action. I also began noticing how my son would sometimes anticipate negative interactions and preemptively adjust his behavior to avoid conflict or discomfort. He would pause before speaking, choose his words carefully, avoid certain topics, and sometimes retreat quietly into play or reading. And while adults might overlook these adaptations as ordinary childhood behavior, I recognized them as survival strategies, a child's way of navigating a potentially harmful environment, and I knew that acknowledging these strategies was essential to understanding the depth of his perception and the reality of the situation we were facing, and that ignoring these subtle signs could put him at risk in ways that were irreversible. Every day I would reflect on the patterns that emerged and the subtle signs that he displayed, and I realized that I could not rely solely on my instincts or feelings. I had to observe, interpret, and plan carefully. I had to create a mental map of his experiences and interactions and be prepared to act decisively when the moment required it, because subtle signs, when recognized and understood, are often the only warning a mother will receive before a situation escalates beyond control. And I was determined to heed these signs without hesitation, to respect his perception and to ensure his safety no matter what challenges lay ahead. And in doing so I strengthened not only my awareness but also my capacity to respond with clarity, courage, and precision. The more I observed, the more I understood the depth of his perception and the validity of his warning, and I realized that this vigilance was not about fear or paranoia. It was about awareness, protection, and proactive action. It was about giving my son the attention, care, and respect he deserved, and ensuring that his voice, even in its subtle and incomplete form, guided my decisions and informed my actions, and that by recognizing and responding to these subtle signs I was taking the first real steps toward safeguarding both his well-being and the truth that he had tried to communicate to me all along. The day everything changed began like any other ordinary morning, the sun streaming faintly through the curtains, the smell of cereal on the counter, the faint hum of a television in the background. And yet the ordinary was a fragile illusion, because beneath it lay a tension I could feel in the pit of my stomach ever since my son had whispered his warning to me months ago, a tension that had grown gradually like a storm building at sea. And that morning the storm finally broke. I was folding laundry in the living room, my little boy playing nearby with his colorful blocks, arranging and rearranging them carefully, when I noticed him glance toward the door, his small brows furrowed, a subtle movement that instantly drew my attention and set my pulse racing, because I had learned to read these signals now. I had learned to see the invisible, and in that split second I realized that something was about to happen, something I could not ignore, and everything my son had tried to tell me converged into a single point of dread that tightened my chest and sharpened my senses. I watched him closely as he paused mid-action, suddenly distracted by a shadow in the hallway. I froze for a heartbeat, too afraid to move. Then slowly I rose to my feet, moving cautiously as though even the slightest motion could alert the unfolding situation. I kept my eyes on him while also scanning the room for any signs of the danger I had been anticipating, and then I saw it, a movement so small yet so unmistakable that my blood ran cold. The way his father emerged from the other room with a controlled smile that did not reach his eyes, the calmness of his movements almost theatrical, as though he had practiced this countless times before. Yet there was an underlying tension in the line of his shoulders, a rigidity that betrayed the intent behind the polished exterior, and I realized in that instant that my son's warning had been more than a precaution. It had been a prophecy, and that what I was about to witness could alter everything I had ever believed about safety, trust, and the ordinary life we had been living. I kept my voice low and my gestures minimal, trying not to draw attention as I guided my son subtly to a corner of the room where he could stay safe while I could observe without alerting the other party. The blocks he had been playing with lay scattered around his small hands, trembled slightly, but he kept his eyes on me, his trust absolute, and I drew strength from that trust, because in that moment I understood the full weight of responsibility resting on my shoulders, the responsibility not just to protect him but to act in a way that would prevent further harm while maintaining composure that would not escalate the situation. Before I fully grasped the depth of what I was about to face, his father approached in a way that seemed benign, casual, yet every step carried a weight that set off alarms in my mind. I noticed the way his hands flexed slightly, the micro expressions on his face that flickered for a fraction of a second, and the deliberate pacing that seemed designed to dominate the space and assert control. I felt my heart race as I processed each signal, because my instincts had never been sharper than in that instant. I knew without a doubt that something serious was happening, and I had to remain calm to prevent it from spiraling further out of control. My son's warning had not prepared me fully for the emotional impact of seeing the truth unfold, but it had prepared me for vigilance. It had prepared me for decisive observation and for the readiness to act with precision that is demanded when innocence is at risk. As he entered the room I noticed the small changes in my son's behavior, the way he shifted slightly behind the sofa, the way he held his small hands together as though bracing for impact, and the way his eyes never left mine, a silent plea for understanding and protection. I felt a surge of maternal clarity and focus wash over me because I realized that in that moment my ability to interpret every micro movement could determine our safety, and the first instinct I acted on was to position myself strategically between him and my son so that I could intervene if necessary while still maintaining a calm exterior. The tension was palpable, and I could sense that the ordinary facade of our morning had completely dissolved and that the truth my son had been trying to convey was now staring me in the face in real time. Then it happened, a sudden movement, a raised voice, a harsh tone that I had never expected to hear from someone I had considered safe and familiar, and it struck me like a physical blow. The way he leaned forward, his words clipped and sharp, the way his eyes darted toward my son, and the subtle threat that hung in the air like a dense fog. I felt my stomach drop and my adrenaline spike, because this was beyond ordinary discipline, beyond ordinary tension. This was a glimpse into something darker that my son had sensed and had tried to warn me about for so long, and I realized that ignoring his previous observations would have been catastrophic, because the danger was not hypothetical, it was real and immediate, and my role was no longer passive observation but active protection. I took a measured step forward, my voice calm yet firm, asking a simple question meant to divert attention. While I assessed the situation, I noticed how his expression flickered briefly between anger and surprise, as if he had underestimated my presence or my awareness, and in that split second I understood. That awareness alone could alter the trajectory of what was unfolding. I began formulating a plan in real time, considering every possible response, every potential escalation, and every subtle signal my son might display that would indicate further risk, and I realized that my son's early warning had been the critical factor, giving me the clarity and readiness to navigate this moment safely. The scene stretched on with agonizing slowness, the tension thick in the air as I kept one hand subtly near my son and the other positioned to intervene if necessary. Each word I spoke was chosen carefully, each gesture calculated to maintain calm and assert control without provoking further aggression. I noticed the rapid micro-expressions that revealed intent. I noticed the subtle changes in posture that signaled escalation, and I realized that I had to read them all simultaneously while also preparing for immediate action if the situation deteriorated further, and I felt the weight of responsibility heavier than I had ever known. Yet I did not falter, because my son's life and emotional safety depended entirely on my awareness and composure in that moment, and I knew that nothing else mattered beyond observing, interpreting, and responding with precision. Then came the moment I will never forget, the instant when the facade broke completely, a sudden sharp movement, a gesture too deliberate to be accidental, a tone too controlled to be benign, and I saw clearly the intent that my son had been trying to convey all along. The warning crystallized into undeniable reality, and the shock of it took my breath away. For a heartbeat my mind struggled to process the inconceivable, and yet amidst the shock a strange clarity emerged. I could see the full scope of the danger, I could anticipate the next moves, and I knew exactly what I had to do to protect my son and myself. The ordinary world of morning routines and family harmony had vanished, and in its place stood a mother's full awareness and determination to shield the innocent from harm. I remember taking a deep breath, feeling every fiber of tension in my body heighten as I positioned myself strategically and subtly guiding my son toward safety. The look in his eyes reflected a mix of fear and trust, and I drew strength from that trust, knowing that he had spoken the truth and that by listening I could prevent a tragedy from unfolding. I spoke softly yet firmly, maintaining an air of calm control, the tension around us thick yet manageable, and I realized in that instant that preparation is as much about perception as it is about action, because recognizing danger before it fully manifests is what allows one to act effectively and protect those who cannot protect themselves. Everything moved in slow motion, the micro-expressions, the subtle shifts in tone and posture, the small hesitations and glances, the silent communications between my son and me. All of it became a language I could understand, a map of intent that guided my every step and allowed me to respond appropriately. And with each passing second I felt my confidence grow, because awareness had transformed fear into action and action into protection, and I understood that the warning my son had given me months ago was not just a caution, it had been a lifeline. It had been the single thread connecting the ordinary to the extraordinary, moment that demanded courage, clarity, and decisive action, and without it I would have been blind to the danger that unfolded before me. As the confrontation reached its peak, the tension finally broke. My son safe by my side, I felt a wave of relief mixed with lingering adrenaline. The ordinary world slowly returned around us, but I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. My son's warning had saved us both and taught me the profound truth that Children see what adults cannot. That subtle signs are the whispers of truth, and that vigilance and awareness are as critical as courage in moments of unexpected danger. And I held my son close, realizing that his small voice had not only warned me but had empowered me to act, and that this moment would forever be etched into my memory as the instant when instinct, awareness and love converged to protect what mattered most. The moment I realized that my son's warning had been a lifeline, I also realized that I had to confront the truth within myself, the truth that I had spent months avoiding, the truth that what I had been seeing in small glimpses for so long was not imagination or exaggeration, but something far more serious, something that demanded awareness, courage and action. And in that moment I felt a strange combination of fear and clarity, because the danger was real and immediate, but so was the opportunity to protect the one I loved more than anything else in the world. And I understood that a mother's instinct is not simply a feeling, it is a force that guides you through uncertainty and teaches you how to act with precision when the stakes are highest. And I felt that force surge through me like electricity, setting every nerve on alert, every sense focused on my son's safety and my own preparedness. And I knew that from this point forward there was no turning back, no denial, no hesitation, only deliberate awareness and decisive action, because the moment demanded it and I had to rise to it fully and completely. I began assessing the situation with careful calculation, noting every detail, every micro expression, every subtle shift in tone or posture, because each one held a clue to what I might need to do next. I noticed how my son's shoulders tensed slightly when his father moved too close, how his hands fidgeted with his favorite toy bear as though drawing strength from it, how his eyes flicked toward me as if silently asking for reassurance. And I realized that each of these small behaviors was a signal, a form of communication that I could read if I remained calm, observant and focused, and that understanding these signals was the key to protecting him without escalating the danger. And in that realization I felt a surge of empowerment, because knowledge transforms fear into strategy and observation transforms panic into precision, and I had both now in abundance because I had learned to see what others overlooked. Every decision I made in that moment was guided by my awareness and instinct. I moved with purpose, but subtly, creating space between my son and the potential threat, positioning myself so that I could intervene if necessary while maintaining a calm exterior so that he would not sense panic. And I realized in that instant that the ordinary courage of everyday life was insufficient, that this was a courage born of necessity, a courage that required complete mental focus and physical readiness, a courage that is not about aggression but about clarity and control. And I felt my heart pounding, not with fear but with an intense clarity of purpose, because I knew exactly what I had to do to ensure safety and preserve stability in a moment that could have spiraled into chaos in an instant. I also understood the importance of communication in that moment, the need to convey calm reassurance to my son without drawing attention from the source of danger, and the delicate balance required to act decisively while also appearing ordinary and unthreatening. It was a lesson in emotional and strategic precision, a lesson that was unfolding in real time and demanded every ounce of focus and intuition I possessed. I spoke softly to my son, using simple words and gestures to let him know I was there to protect him and to guide him through this frightening situation, and I watched closely as his body language gradually relaxed just enough to show trust and compliance while still remaining aware of the threat in the room. And I felt a surge of pride and relief that my observation and interpretation had allowed me to communicate effectively without words, that my son had understood and trusted my guidance implicitly, and that trust itself became a source of strength as I prepared to act if necessary. The tension in the room was palpable, every movement measured, every glance charged with significance. I noticed the way his father's posture shifted, the subtle flicker in his eyes, the brief hesitation in his voice, and I realized that awareness alone could be a tool to de-escalate potential conflict, that perception could create openings for action that would not provoke further aggression. And I began using subtle strategies honed instinctively by observation and necessity. I adjusted my position, my stance, my voice, all in ways that conveyed calm authority without alerting the source of danger. And I felt the power of awareness as a protective tool, a weapon of insight that allowed me to maintain control over an unpredictable situation and ensure the safety of my son while still managing the emotional stakes of the encounter. At the same time I began to reflect on how my son had been perceiving the environment, how he had been interpreting gestures and tone that I had barely noticed before, and how he had been communicating his unease through subtle signs that required me to listen with more than my ears and see with more than my eyes. I realized that he had been trying to prepare me as much as he had been preparing himself, that his warning had been a signal not only of danger but also of trust and connection, and that my role was to honor that trust by translating his signals into protective action and creating creating a safe space where he could feel secure and understood, and I felt an immense sense of responsibility to rise fully to that role because the consequences of misinterpretation or inaction could have been catastrophic. Every second felt elongated as the situation continued to unfold. I observed every nuance, every hesitation, every flicker of expression, using my knowledge of my son and my understanding of human behavior to anticipate potential escalations and prepare my responses in advance. I noticed the micro movements of tension in my son's small body, the subtle shifts in his attention and the tiny adjustments in his posture that indicated both fear and readiness, and I realized that being attuned to these subtle cues was crucial because they provided a roadmap for my actions and allowed me to intervene with precision if necessary. And I drew upon all the observation skills I had cultivated over months of careful attention to children's behavior and interactions in order to read the situation accurately and ensure that my responses were effective and timely. In that moment I also recognized the emotional stakes, the fear and tension that my son was experiencing, and the impact of the situation on his developing sense of security. I understood that my calm and deliberate actions were not just about physical safety but about emotional reassurance, creating an environment where he could trust that he was protected and that I was fully attuned to his needs and perceptions. And I realized that the subtle signs he had been giving me for months had prepared me for this very moment, had allowed me to recognize danger before it fully manifested, and had equipped me with the mental and emotional clarity necessary to act decisively and compassionately under pressure. And I felt a profound sense of connection and purpose that strengthened my resolve. I began to internalize the lesson that awareness, observation, and responsiveness are intertwined, that vigilance and calm are not opposites but complementary forces that allow a parent to navigate unpredictable situations with clarity and authority, that acting with precision in moments of danger requires both perception and emotional regulation, and that a mother's instinct is a finely tuned instrument that can guide action and interpretation simultaneously. And I felt the full weight and power of that instinct surge through me as I positioned myself, communicated silently with my son, and prepared to act if necessary while maintaining a calm and controlled exterior. And I knew that this combination of awareness, vigilance, and instinctual courage was what would ultimately protect us both. By the end of the encounter I had realized fully how much my son had been perceiving and communicating, that I had initially dismissed the importance of subtle signs of distress and the depth of his understanding of his own environment, and I felt gratitude and awe at his perceptiveness and resilience. And I understood that listening to him and observing him carefully had transformed what could have been a moment of helplessness into an opportunity for proactive protection and decisive action. And I knew that the awareness I had cultivated in these months of subtle observation had given me the tools, the clarity, and the courage to navigate an unpredictable and dangerous situation successfully and preserve the safety and emotional well-being of the most precious person in my life. Once I understood the immediate danger and the clarity that had come from observing my son and interpreting every subtle cue, I knew that I had to take action. I could no longer stand idly by or wait for the situation to resolve itself. I had to create a plan and execute it carefully, deliberately, and with full awareness, because every second mattered and the stakes were impossibly high. My son's safety depended on my ability to act decisively while maintaining a calm presence, and the lessons I had learned from months of observing his subtle signs and trusting my instincts now converged into a roadmap for protection. I guided him gently toward a safer corner of the room, using soft words of reassurance and small gestures that communicated both calm and authority, because I knew that panic would only amplify fear and that my composure would be the anchor that steadied him even as tension charged the air around us. I began surveying the space around us with precision, noting every possible route of escape, every object that could provide cover or be used as a barrier between us and potential harm. I observed the distance between myself and the source of danger, the angles at which interactions could escalate, and the subtle movements that might indicate an immediate threat. And I made mental calculations of timing and positioning in real time, because awareness and anticipation are as critical as courage when responding to a potentially dangerous situation. And I understood that preparation in the moment is the difference between chaos and control, and between vulnerability and safety. And I drew upon every instinctive skill I had developed as a mother to maintain awareness while simultaneously maintaining calm for my son Sake. My son stayed close to me, silently trusting my guidance, and I noticed how he adjusted his posture, subtly following my movements, with his small body responding instinctively to my cues, and I realized that his trust and my careful observation were intertwined, his awareness informing my decisions reinforcing his sense of safety, and together we formed a silent strategy of survival that relied on communication without words and the unspoken understanding between parent and child that only develops in moments of true urgency. I spoke softly to him, occasionally offering reassurance using words that conveyed both confidence and calm, and I watched his body relax slightly with each word and gesture, and I understood the profound responsibility inherent in being the source of safety for someone who relies entirely on your judgment and presence. I began formulating the sequence of actions I would take should the situation escalate. I prepared for multiple scenarios, imagining how interactions could unfold and rehearsing in my mind how I would respond without alarming my son or provoking the source of danger. Each thought was deliberate, each plan layered with contingencies, because in moments of crisis thinking ahead is as essential as reacting swiftly, and I understood that flexibility and adaptability were critical because no plan survives entirely intact in the unpredictable dynamics of human behavior, and my task was to ensure that I could maintain control and safety while navigating every possible development. Every second was amplified by heightened awareness, the micro-expressions of my son, the subtle shifts in posture, the brief hesitations in speech, all of it became data points that informed my decisions and guided my movements. I noticed how he would glance at me with silent questions, and I answered with gestures and expressions that communicated strategy, reassurance, and readiness, and I realized that the small details he had been signaling for months were now playing out in real time, and my ability to interpret them accurately was what would enable me to act decisively and protect him while maintaining composure and clarity. And I felt a surge of determination and purpose unlike anything I had experienced before, because I understood the full responsibility and power of a mother's vigilance and readiness to act. The air was thick with tension and each interaction charged with potential escalation. I maintained a calm tone in my voice and carefully modulated my gestures to signal safety to my son without provoking the source of danger. I moved strategically, positioning myself to create distance if necessary and using small obstacles and the layout of the room to my advantage, while constantly scanning for changes in posture, expression, and movement that might indicate an immediate threat. And I realized that anticipation and perception were as powerful as any physical measure I could take, and that the subtle awareness I had cultivated over months of observation was the most potent tool in ensuring our safety and readiness to act. I guided my son gently as I moved toward a more secure area, carefully ensuring that he remained calm and aware of my presence and reassurance without drawing attention from the source of danger. I whispered soft instructions, reminding him to stay close to me, to move slowly, to mirror my posture, and to observe without alarm, and I watched as he adjusted, instinctively following my lead, and I felt a swell of pride and relief that the months of listening to his subtle warnings and observing his behavior had prepared us both for this critical moment, and that our awareness and connection had created a protective network that enabled us to act safely and deliberately in real time. At the same time, I maintained a mental map of potential responses. I anticipated how interactions could evolve and prepared contingency actions. I considered how the source of danger might react to my movements, my tone, my positioning, and I adjusted subtly to mitigate escalation and maintain control over the environment. And I realized that being proactive rather than reactive was essential in moments where danger is present, because every choice carries consequences, and the ability to anticipate outcomes provides leverage and control. And I drew strength from my ability to remain aware and composed while acting decisively and deliberately to protect my son. I also observed the emotional currents at play, the fear and tension in my son, his reliance on my guidance, the subtle signals of intent from the source of danger, and I realized that my responses had to balance physical positioning with emotional reassurance to maintain his sense of security while managing the unpredictable dynamics of human behavior. And I felt a deep sense of empowerment as I guided him with gentle authority, using gestures, words, and positioning that communicated strategy and protection. And I understood that awareness coupled with calm and decisive action could transform a moment of vulnerability into a moment of control and safety, and that my son's early warning had been the key to unlocking that capacity. Every action was deliberate, every movement intentional, every word calculated to convey reassurance and maintain authority. I positioned myself strategically between my son and potential harm, using subtle barriers in the layout of the room to create a safe space while remaining alert to any signs of escalation, and I observed every micro-expression, every shift in tone and posture to anticipate potential threats, and I felt the surge of maternal instinct that had been building over months come to fruition as awareness and action converged into precise protective measures, and I realized that my ability to interpret subtle cues had not only allowed me to maintain control but had prevented a situation that could have quickly spiraled out of control into harm or fear. By the end of the encounter, I understood fully the power of preparation, awareness, observation, and decisive action. I recognized that my son's warning had been more than just a caution. It had been a gift, a lifeline that enabled me to act with clarity, courage, and precision, and I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that vigilance, intuition, and deliberate action can transform fear into protection and ensure the safety and well-being of the ones we love most. And I held my son close, understanding that our connection had been strengthened through the ordeal, and that my responsiveness and awareness had created not just physical safety but emotional reassurance and trust that would endure beyond the moment of danger. After the danger had passed and my son was safely in my arms, I realized that the moment of crisis had changed everything. It had altered the way I saw my child, the way I saw myself, and the way I understood the world around us. I felt a deep, almost overwhelming sense of responsibility and gratitude, because months of subtle observation had prepared me to act decisively, and now the aftermath was teaching me the lessons that only experience can provide. I held him close, feeling the rhythm of his small heartbeat against mine, and I understood for the first time how profoundly children perceive the world, how their instincts and observations are often sharper and more honest than the perceptions of adults who have learned to rationalize and ignore inconvenient truths. And I promised myself that I would never again dismiss the quiet warnings of his insight, the small expressions, the gestures that carry meaning beyond words, because in those moments of silent communication lay the power to prevent harm and the ability to act with clarity and love when it mattered most. The hours and days that followed were filled with reflection and planning. I began to consider not only the immediate safety of my son but also the long-term implications of what we had experienced, the trust he had placed in me, the lessons I had learned about awareness and preparation, and the responsibility of translating subtle observations into decisive protective action. All of it weighed heavily on my mind, yet gave me a sense of clarity I had never experienced before. I realized that vigilance and action must coexist, that observation without intervention is incomplete, and that protection without awareness is inadequate, and I committed to cultivating both in every aspect of my parenting, because the stakes are far too high to rely solely on hope or chance. I also recognized the importance of emotional healing for both my son and myself. The fear and tension of the encounter could not simply be erased with a few comforting words. They required deliberate attention, care, and understanding. I spoke with him gently about his feelings, using language appropriate to his age, acknowledging his fear, validating his perceptions, and reinforcing his courage and resilience, and I felt the profound bond between us deepen, because he knew that his voice mattered, that his warning had been heard, and that his experience had been honored and acted upon, and I knew that this validation would empower him in ways that extended far beyond the immediate crisis, because children who are listened to and protected learn to trust their own instincts and develop a sense of security that is foundational for future challenges. In the days that followed, I also reflected on the broader lessons of awareness, observation, and action. I realized that life often presents situations that are unpredictable and potentially dangerous, and that preparation is not just about physical readiness but about mental clarity, emotional regulation, and the ability to interpret subtle signs accurately. I considered how my son had communicated his unease through gestures, tone, and behavior, and I understood that his warning had been a catalyst for my own heightened perception and responsiveness, and that this awareness had been critical to our safety and well-being, and I vowed to cultivate this vigilance continuously to ensure that we could respond effectively to future challenges, whether subtle or immediate. I also considered the role of trust and communication within the parent-child relationship, and how essential it is to create an environment where children feel safe expressing concerns and fears, no matter how small or incomplete their words may be. I realized that my son's ability to warn me had been empowered by the foundation of trust and responsiveness I had established over time, and that honoring this trust required active listening, careful observation, and deliberate action, and I felt a renewed commitment to fostering this connection and ensuring that his voice would always be heard and respected, because it is through that connection that protection and guidance are made possible and effective. I reflected on the courage required to act decisively in moments of crisis, the way awareness and observation must be paired with intentional action, and how a mother's intuition is both a shield and a guide in situations of uncertainty. I recalled the way my body had responded instinctively during the encounter, the clarity of thought that emerged from months of careful attention, the confidence to move strategically and to communicate silently with my son while maintaining composure and control. And I understood that courage is not the absence of fear but the ability to act in spite of it, and that true preparedness combines awareness, vigilance, and action into a cohesive force capable of protecting those who are vulnerable and dependent on us for guidance and safety. I also considered the importance of planning for long-term emotional and physical security, the need to establish routines, safe spaces, and strategies that reinforce a child's sense of security and trust. I began thinking about ways to empower my son through gradual awareness building, teaching him to recognize his own instincts and signals and to communicate them effectively. I realized that this experience, though frightening, had the potential to strengthen him in ways that would help him navigate the world with confidence and resilience, and that my role as a mother was to support this growth while maintaining an unwavering commitment to his protection and well-being. At the same time, I grappled with the emotional aftermath of recognizing the depth of danger that had existed right in our home. The knowledge that a person I had trusted could present such a threat filled me with a complex mix of fear, anger, and clarity. I realized that my own vigilance had to extend beyond instinct to encompass strategy, careful observation, and ongoing awareness. I began considering what steps would be necessary to ensure our continued safety, how to maintain a protective environment, and how to recognize subtle cues of potential threats in the future. And I understood that these lessons were as much about emotional resilience and preparedness as they were about physical protection, and that both were essential for the well-being of myself and my child. I reflected also on the gratitude I felt for my son's warning. Without it, the entire course of events could have been tragically different. I felt awe at his perception and insight, his ability to sense danger and communicate it even in small, subtle ways. I understood that children often see truths that adults overlook, and that their observations should be taken seriously, honored, and acted upon. And I committed to always listening to him and interpreting his cues with care and attention, because his voice had been our first line of defense, and it had given me the clarity and courage to act decisively and protect him and myself when it mattered most. In the days, weeks, and months that followed, I saw the lasting impact of our experience on both of us. My son grew more confident in his ability to communicate his fears. My trust in my own instincts deepened, and I understood that the bond forged through crisis and vigilance had created a foundation of resilience, awareness, and empowerment. I realized that the lessons of this experience extended beyond the immediate danger into broader principles of life: vigilance, observation, careful decision-making, courage, and the importance of listening to those who are often overlooked, because their voices, though quiet, carry profound truths that can prevent harm and empower growth and resilience. And I felt a deep sense of fulfillment and responsibility for translating these lessons into ongoing protection and guidance. Finally, I understood that the combination of awareness, action, vigilance, and emotional validation creates a powerful force for protection and resilience, and that by responding to subtle cues, listening to warnings, and acting decisively, a parent can navigate even the most frightening and unpredictable situations successfully. I held my son close, reflecting on the journey that had led to this moment, and I realized that our shared experience had strengthened not only our bond but also my own capacity for clarity, courage, and decisive action. I understood fully that his early warning had not only saved us in that moment but had taught me enduring lessons about observation, action, trust, and maternal instinct that would guide us for the rest of our lives. And I felt a profound sense of gratitude, determination, and empowerment, knowing that vigilance and love had converged to protect what mattered most, and that together we had emerged stronger, safer, and more resilient than ever before.